Professor Philip Jenkins is the Distinguished Professor of History and Religious Studies at Pennsylvania State University, where he has taught since 1980. He has written extensively on the globalization of Christianity and other topics in over 20 books and 120 book chapters and refereed articles, as well as in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, Christian Century, and many others. Among these books are Decade of Nightmares, The End of the 60s and Makings of the 80s in America, A History of the United States, Hidden Gospels, How the Search for Jesus Lost Its Way, Mystics and Messiahs, Cults and New Religions in American History, Images of Terror, What We Can and Can't Know About Terrorism, The New Anti-Catholicism, The Last Acceptable Prejudice, Dream Catchers, How Mainstream America Discovered Native Spirituality, and his most recent book, The New Faces of Christianity, Believing the Bible in the Global South. As you may know, our book of the semester selection is The Next Christendom, the Coming of Global Christianity, which won the 2003 Christianity Today Book Award, the Gold Medallion Book Award, and the Theologus Book Award for Best Academic Book. Jim Wallace, the author of God's Politics, has said of his most recent book, and I think this applies to The Next Christendom as well, this is an important new book by one of the preeminent scholars of contemporary Christianity. Perhaps more than any other church historian in the affluent North, Philip Jenkins understands how the Church of the Global South will transform the Christian faith in the world. This book challenges our usual reading of the Bible with profound insights from Christians who help us relearn truths that much of Western Christianity has forgotten. Like his groundbreaking The Next Christendom, this is absolutely essential reading for all who are seeking to understand the future of the Church in the 21st century. Professor Jenkins has taught a wide variety of courses from history, religious studies, to criminal studies and American studies. He received a PhD from the University of Cambridge and obtained a double first-class honors Bachelor of Arts in History and Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic Studies. During his graduate studies, he was a research officer on an Oxford and Cambridge project on the history of criminal law. Among his many achievements, he's won 2 teaching awards, the Pennsylvania State Alumni Teaching Fellow Award in 2003 and the Class of 1993 Award for Distinguished Humanities Professor. In 2005, he was a consultant on religious matters for the U.S. government's 2005 report, Mapping the Global Future, report of the National Intelligence Council's project. Professor Jenkins, interestingly enough, was cited by our president, President Cecil Samuelson, in his talk, A More Excellent Way, A Changing BYU in a Changing World, at the annual university conference held on the 24th of August 2004, in which President Samuelson states, quote, "If I may, let me mention some of the world changes that are shaping our futures. You will be able to think of many such examples. First, amidst very dramatic shifts in global population concentrations, Christianity is moving southward. Many people, including Christians from the Southern Hemisphere, are moving north, but the growth of the Christian faith is progressing most quickly and remarkably in the Southern Hemisphere, including Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Our church is no exception, and the worldwide church of the relatively near future is likely to be more Southern, less formally educated, less materially well off, and less Caucasian. No wonder President Hinckley was prompted to begin the Perpetual Education Fund." Unquote. Professor Jenkins is married. His wife Elizabeth is here with us today, and we welcome her to Provo as well. And they have 2 daughters. We are very pleased to welcome to campus, and please join me in recognizing Professor Philip Jenkins.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and it's a great honor to be here. It's also an enormous pleasure to be in Utah, a part of the world I love deeply. I'd like to begin by a quotation which might be an example not just of a prophecy, but of a prophecy which is empirically verifiable. And this is from the 17th century. It's from a Roman Catholic saint by the name of St. Vincent de Paul, who back in the year 1640 was looking at the world around him, and it was a terrible time. It was a world in which Catholics were killing Protestants, Protestants were killing Catholics, Christians were killing Jews. And he made an observation. He said, Jesus said that his church would last until the end of time, but he never once mentioned the word Europe. The church of the future, he said, in the year 1640, would be the church of South America, the Church of Africa, the Church of China, and Japan. And I put it to you that that is as close as we can get, perhaps, to a very empirically verifiable prophecy. We might disagree, perhaps, with the influence of Christianity in Japan, though Japan has produced some very fine Christian writers, a very great Christian novelist by the name of Shisako Endo. But otherwise, that is what is happening. Christianity is moving decisively to the global south, to those three continents. It would be very easy to tell this story in terms of overwhelming numbers, and there's a great temptation to bludgeon people with statistics and numbers. And I don't want to do that, but some of them really clamour for quotation, just to give you a rough framework of what's happening. In the world today, there are approximately 2 billion Christians. Of those, the largest contingent, around about 510 million, live in Europe. Close behind is Latin America, with 490 million. Africa has about 380 million. However, if we project that film forward into the future, the numbers change quite rapidly. Already by 2025, the title for the most Christian continent, the continent with the largest number of Christians, will be in competition between Africa and Latin America. If we move further into the future, however, there's no doubt, by 2050 or thereabouts, Africa wins. In terms of distribution of population, Christianity will be chiefly a religion of Africa and the African diaspora. That will, in a sense, be the heartland of Christianity. If you look at the countries in the world which will have the largest Christian populations, well, let me give you one projection for the year 2050. And as one might say in this context, I do not claim this is gospel, but it is plausible. Where will the largest Christian populations be in 2050? At the head of the list still will be the United States, followed in no particular order by Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, the Congo, Ethiopia, the Philippines, and China. Now, if you ask an older person, they might be able to tell you of something they remember from their youth called Western Christianity. Whether it still exists is a matter of some debate. If you look at any one of the churches, this is the key story. If I ask you to think, for example, of a typical Roman Catholic, what do you think of? What does that person look like? Well, a couple of figures to bear in mind. Last year, there were more Roman Catholic baptisms in the Philippines than in France, Spain, Italy, and Poland combined. These days, countries like Nigeria and the Philippines and Mexico are exporting priests to countries that used to be the great heartlands of Catholic Christianity. You can go to Ireland and meet Nigerian priests because there are not enough Irish priests. So you go where they can be found. If the change I'm describing was just a change of ethnicity or geography, then it would be interesting. It would be didn't know that. But I'm going to suggest to you that it's actually a much more important change, because the character of that Christianity, as it moves south, is also changing substantially. I do not claim there is such a thing as a southern Christianity. The Christianities of the global south are very diverse. But they have certain things in common which I suggest to you are of great interest and great significance for a church like this church. Because the kinds of Christianity that are succeeding across much of the global south tend to be more traditional in their view of religious authority. They are charismatic in the sense of being open to ideas of dreams and prophecies and visions. They are deeply committed to ideas of healing. They are, in that sense, more supernaturally oriented. And we are already seeing some very telling gaps between northern and southern churches as numbers grow. For example, within the Anglican Communion, there's a very interesting shift. The American branch of the Anglican Communion is the Episcopal Church. It's a very liberal body. A couple of years ago, it appointed an actively gay bishop, much to the horror of the churches of the Global South, especially in Africa, who protested very strongly. And the American Episcopal Church basically said, "Who are you to tell us this?" And then the bishops of the Global South told them who they were to tell them this. "You," they said, "you in America, you have 2 million Episcopalians, and the number is going down fast. In Nigeria, back in 1975, we had 5 million Anglicans. Now we've got 20 million. It's going to be 35 million by 2025. Of course, we are not the largest, we're not the only big church in the Anglican, that is English Communion. No, there are lots of others. There's Uganda, there's Kenya." The heart of the church has moved south, like many other churches and denominations. And when some of those churches look at what their liberal brethren in the north are doing, they are very disturbed. And some of the language in the Anglican debates has become very harsh. One recent statement from the Nigerian church discussing the American Episcopal Church begins with the line, "When a cancerous lump in the body has resisted all treatment, the time has come for it to be excised. Some feel this is lacking in Christian charity, however." When Northerners, people in the global north, look at some of these comments, they assume that perhaps churches in the global south are backward, uneducated, primitive. They have this very fundamentalist approach. But I want to suggest something different. I want to suggest there are reasons not just for conversion to Christianity, the spread of Christianity, but also the particular kinds of Christianity that are growing. And in short, I want to suggest that there are many features, characteristics of the societies into which Christianity is moving that give people a special taste, a special liking, a special preference for the Bible. And when you read the Bible, when you read the scriptures in a way that makes it seem like your book, describing your society, your reality, then it tends to give scripture more moral force. You can no longer use the argument, for example, that say many Americans might use, that, well, what it says in the Old Testament is interesting historically, but it just describes such a different world. What does it have to do with us today? If you are in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it is exactly those parts of the Old Testament that have this kind of documentary relevance, where it seems to be describing your world. And so you tend to take the moral prescriptions very seriously. Let me give you some examples of this. First of all, I think for many American Christians, many European Christians, the Old Testament is a puzzling book. It is a distant book. It is a book that is hard to take seriously as a direct kind of instruction. In much of Africa, in much of Asia, the main danger with the Old Testament is that it has too much appeal. The main danger is that it is hard to make the argument that it is, in a sense, superseded by the New Testament. Why? Think about it. Imagine if you are trying to preach the Bible in a society that knows about things like nomadism, paganism, polygamy, blood sacrifice, that regards these as familiar parts of life. Even if a sophisticated urban African does not know these things directly at first hand, he or she has relatives, has neighbors who do know these things. The Old Testament, therefore, describes this kind of world. If a church speaks the lesson of prophecy as a continuing force, once again, that is something which makes great relevance, that has great relevance in a society that takes prophecy seriously. It is more likely to be accepted than another church that says that once upon a time there was prophecy, but then that message peters out. To take one example, much evangelical Christianity is based on ideas of atonement, the atoning death of Christ, which I think for many Americans is a puzzling and even a repulsive doctrine, the idea that blood is shed for sin. If you try and preach this message in Africa, however, you are speaking to a society where people know about blood sacrifice, where it is a familiar reality, where sacrificing, for instance, a sheep or a goat is a very well-known part of life. When I talk to evangelicals in this country, for example, who use terms like power in the blood, then I'm often tempted to ask them, so have you ever seen a blood sacrifice? Have you ever smelt a blood sacrifice? The answer is usually no. But it does give a great deal of power. There's a great West African theologian by the name of Kwame Bediako, and he was doing a commentary on the letters of Paul. And he chose one letter particularly as being Africa's epistle, an epistle that reads as if it was written directly to and for Africans. And that was the Epistle to the Hebrews. And you think, well, why is that? What is the Epistle to the Hebrews? It is an epistle which is all about the rituals of the Jewish temple, the sacrifices, the rituals of the priests in that temple, rituals which for many Americans, many denominations, again, are archaic, puzzling, it's a strange world. But for Africans, they know these ideas. When Africans read the book of Revelation and they read about the altar, the lamb, the throne, the blood, well, yeah, these are familiar things. These are things we know all about. So a large part of the message has already been conveyed. You get this very strongly if you look at hymns in the contemporary global South. Let me make what may sound like a strange observation to you. We are today living in the greatest ever age of Christian hymn writing. More hymns are being composed now, being sung now, but most of them are not accessible to us as Americans because they're in languages we do not know. They are in Yoruba, they are in Luganda. But some of the stories of these hymns are just remarkable. One of the most powerful is one called the Tuku Tendereza Yezu, which is the great hymn of East African Christianity. And you read the stories associated with this, and you hear the stories, and they're amazing. You know, you hear stories, for instance, of African Christians who are on the point of being murdered by the forces of a hostile army. They will sing this hymn, and the soldiers about to kill them will join in before letting them go. This is a hymn of enormous power. What is it about? It is about the power in the blood. It is about atonement. It is about these ideas which are Christian ideas which carry such special weight for that kind of audience because they also speak to familiar traditional ideas. I make one other observation. As Christianity moves to the global South, Christianity is also entering a world which is a very poor world. If you want to think of the average Christian in the world today, then think of perhaps a woman living in a village in Nigeria, or a favela, a shanty town in Brazil. Probably somebody who by typical American standards is inconceivably poor. And when somebody like that reads or hears the stories in the Gospels or the Scriptures, they hear about the world which is so familiar to them. A world in which, of course, a poor woman who loses a coin is going to ransack the house trying to find it, because that's all she has to pay for her kids' food that night. Let me just read you one quick quote here from an author called Francisco Goldman, writing about Guatemala. Guatemala certainly feels biblical. Sheep, swine, donkeys, serpents, these are everywhere. So are centurions, all manner of wandering false prophets, Pharisees, lepers and whores. The poor, rural, mainly Mayan landscape has an aura of the miraculous. It is the perfect backdrop for religious parables about fields barren and fertile, fruits and harvests, hunger and plenty. when you read the Scriptures through third world eyes, when you read the Scriptures through hungry eyes, you begin to realize some things. You begin to realize how much of Bible, Scripture, is about food. Why? Because, of course, food is the most important thing in the world. If you want to convey a lesson, a metaphor, you do it in terms of food. You do it in terms of what John Lonsdale, great African scholar, calls the language of the belly. If you want to talk about politics, everything is in terms of a bite. A bribe is a bite, and so on. This was brought home to me not long ago. I was talking to some West Africans about this point, and they said, there are many things in the Bible which make great sense to us, which perhaps don't make as much sense to Americans. And we came up with some obvious examples, like the parable of the sower, and then said, of course, the one which really carries all the weight is Psalm 126. Well, you see, I'm a college professor, and my career depends on not revealing my ignorance. Okay? So I try bluffing for a few seconds, and then eventually I say, I give up. What are you talking about? I say, well, it's obvious. That's always a phrase to avoid. It's obvious. Psalm 126, a much quoted scripture, which includes the famous line, the man who goes out into the fields in weeping, in tears, to sow the seed, will return in joy bearing the sheaves. You sow in weeping, you reap in rejoicing. If you ever hear this scripture, it's quite often used in the context of a funeral, and it's associated with the idea of death and resurrection. But let me ask you, why do people sow in weeping? So my West Africans had the answer. Well, they said, it's obvious. So I'm thinking, I hate you. Tell me. Why is it obvious? Well, it's obvious. When the psalm was composed, there'd obviously been a famine. There was a famine in the world, just like we had 2 years ago. When there is a famine, you have a limited amount of corn, and you have a choice. You can use the corn to make food then to feed your children, or you can sow the seed corn and have it grow for next year. But in order to do that, you literally, almost literally, have to take it out of the hands of your hungry children, to take it away. So you sow in weeping, and then you rejoice when you bring home the sheaves. And this is not just one small part of the world. There are many parts of the world where there's a standard greeting and response. How are you? And the response is, my children are hungry. Because that is the time of the year, that is the time of the farming cycle. So when you have this in mind, when you have this image of food, you begin to look back at especially the New Testament and see how much of it is about food. When, for example, people wanted to convey the image of the day of the Lord, this immeasurably glorious time when God would rule, how do you convey that image? It'll be such an amazing time that it'll be like a great banquet where everyone has enough to eat. Can you imagine such a setting? Or even in the words of Mary in the Gospel of Luke, God will fill the hungry with good things, and the real bonus, send the rich empty away. How do you convey the reversal of the day of the Lord? Even the rich won't have enough to eat, but the poor will. I'd just like to offer you a grace from a Chinese house church. And like many things that you see in Global South Christianity, this is the sort of prayer that could have been uttered in the earliest days of the Christian church. Today's food is not easy to come by, protection from God. The assumption is that the meal you have, you can rely on what's on the table in front of you, but you cannot rely on the next meal. And receiving the food from God is also associated with protection from other ills. You know, the other thing you notice is just how much in the Bible is conditioned by famine, by stories of famine. I think for most of us today, when we read stories of famine, this is something that maybe we've seen about in news documentaries or we read about. Imagine living in societies where famine is a frequent occurrence. Why do Joseph's brothers go into Egypt? A time of famine arose. You realize how much of the Bible is about famine. One of the books of the Bible which is most beloved in Africa is the book of Ruth. Why would that be? I can't possibly think. It's a story about a society that's been destroyed by famine, in which society has basically collapsed, in which the men have gone off to the city because they can, in which the women are left behind with the children to try and hold the society together, and in which society survives insofar as it does by people being loyal to each other and their obligations to kin. I can't for a moment think why something like that would carry so much weight in Africa, whereas I say it carries a kind of documentary relevance. When you look at the Bible through Global South eyes, you almost begin to see a different Bible. What I mean by that is there are passages within the Bible which perhaps do not carry so much weight for an American audience or a European audience in Africa or Asia. They carry so much weight. One scripture I have rediscovered in the last couple of years is what's called the Epistle of James. Now, the Epistle of James is one of these works which shows up in all sorts of places. And I think of one very appropriate reference for where we are, which is, of course, the spiritual Odyssey of Joseph Smith, began when he read that Bible verse from the first chapter of James about pray to God and seek wisdom. James has all sorts of passages which lead people on strange courses in their lives. James is also one of the main providers of sermon texts in African churches. One verse particularly, and you can, if you know the epistle, you can work it out. James says, you say that tomorrow you're going to do this, you're going to travel to this city, you're going to do this business. You fool! You don't know you'll be able to do that. Your life is a vapor. Your life is a mist. It is here today and you don't know if it'll be there tomorrow. What you actually should say is, if the Lord wills, I will do this tomorrow. We read this in America, we read this in Europe, and we think, an interesting bit of philosophy. Now try reading it in an African church, where the average age of the congregation is, 20? Where the pastor is this ancient, grey-bearded old man of maybe 28, and where the average age of death in the community is 38. Your life is a mist. And passages like those of James carry a lot of weight. A few years ago, I heard a talk by an Anglican archbishop of a Central African province. And he was describing an interesting world which in some ways many Christians around the world would look at and say, what a great situation. He was complaining at the fact of being so overworked that he wanted to go on strike. And what he said was this: it's terrible. Every Sunday they will say to you, Archbishop, come along to our village. We want to consecrate a new church here. And you go along the road and there are hundreds of people and you go to this vast new church, and then they do it to you. They say, Archbishop, while you're in the area, could you come along and consecrate another new church? And, the idea was, there are new churches springing up everywhere. He also said two other things. He also said none of his clergy had been paid in 6 months. And he also said that he had never yet presided over a funeral where there were less than 12 bodies. So you combine the prevalence of poverty and sickness and death with a level of church growth which would be astounding. And that mix of poverty and deep, passionate religion is very characteristic. By the way, one interesting thing about James also provides a very good way of speaking between different religions. Why is this? Because Islam, Buddhism, other religions also grew up in societies which shared many of the same conditions, shared conditions of poverty, hunger, disease. In fact, James actually sounds very Muslim when he translates it. It even calls God compassionate and merciful. And if you ever deal with a Muslim society, everywhere you go, you hear this phrase, if it is God's will. If you ever fly on a Middle East airline, they announce the plane will be taking off in 2 minutes. If it is God's will. That can bother you. In the context of Buddhism, James has a unique power because it preaches this basic idea of transience. Your life is a mist. Recently, an English publisher reprinted many books of the Bible, and in each case with an introduction by a celebrity, author, novelist, actor, religious figure, a lot of big pop culture figures. And one of the texts was the Epistle of James. Who did they get to write the introduction to the Epistle of James? Someone you've heard of, the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama began by saying, I don't know much about Christianity. I know a lot about Buddhism. This is fine Buddhism. James has this very interesting quality. And sometimes you think, if you were to try and evangelize a community, and you could only use one part of Scripture, one book, one text, what would it be? And many possibilities come to mind. But there's some evangelists in the field, some missionaries in the field, who actually think, well, if you want to speak to people and say, let's look at something which describes your life and builds on that, James carries a lot of weight. One other very important area is the area of good and evil. And this is a matter in which northern and southern churches tend to be quite divided. Now, it's certainly not a straight north-south division, but for most liberal, quote, mainline, unquote, churches in the global north, many of the passages in the New Testament especially about demons and healings and exorcisms are so irrelevant, they've almost ceased to be an embarrassment. They're just not part of what they pay attention to. But to quote Jim Wallace again, Jim Wallace once said that if you take references to the poor out of the Bible, you're not left with much. He's dead right. If you take references to angels and healings and exorcisms and demons out of the Bible, you're left with a pretty thin pamphlet. And this is a point which I think many Global South churches have taken very seriously. If you are interested in speaking about Christianity in the Global South, you have to speak into a world in which the world of demons and spirits and curses is taken absolutely seriously. It's been said by a very sane and sober mission scholar that the two biggest areas of difficulty for white churches in Africa are ancestors and witchcraft. Even to speak of those things is an embarrassment. In African communities, however, unless you address those subjects, you are not speaking languages of vital concern. And that's why people turn to the New Testament, which was dealing with very similar concepts. You know, there's a scholar called Andrew Walls, and he once said, if you want to see the Christian church of the 2nd century in operation, you can basically do one of two things. You can either invent a time machine, or you can buy an air ticket to Africa. And the air ticket to Africa is cheaper. If you look at the prayers, and once again, the hymns that are coming out of contemporary Africa, not just Africa, India, China, Korea, so many of them read as if they were written 1800 years ago. Let me give you one example. This is a hymn from the contemporary Transvaal in South Africa. Why is Jesus important? Jesus is important because he has destroyed our ancient fears. He has trampled underneath the demons that we used to be scared of. Jesus Christ is conqueror. By his resurrection, he overcame death itself. By his resurrection, he overcame all things. He overcame magic. He overcame amulets and charms. He overcame the darkness of demon possession. He overcame dread. When we are with him, we also conquer. That hymn could have been composed in the year 150. It was actually composed about 1970. I mentioned some of these hymns, by the way. You're probably aware of the fact in American churches, many of them are very embarrassed by the hymns that used to be popular 100 years ago, because they were very patriarchal and they were sort of very militaristic and aggressive, and so people try and change them to make them nicer. Well, here's an example of a contemporary African hymn, and I particularly like this because it's by a woman from Ghana, and when you listen to it, you can pick up the very gentle woman's touch in it. If Satan troubles us, Jesus Christ, you are the lion of the grasslands, you whose claws are sharp. You will tear out his entrails and leave them on the ground for the flies to eat. I'm glad we don't have any of these nasty, aggressive hymns. Demonology is credible for African and Asian Christians in a way in which it has not been for European Christians or American Christians for a good long time. True story. I was once talking to a white American clergyman who's an Adventist, Seventh-day Adventist. And very, very sort of likable, youngish man, and he'd visited Africa, and he'd gone to a South African Adventist church in an area in which white faces were not normally seen. And this was a very typical African service. The building is that big, the congregation is that big. You have several hundred people trying to get into a building far too small for them. And when he arrives, people are initially very startled to see a white face, because not expected in that area. And they begin talking to him, and they say, so why are you here? Oh, that's wonderful news. You're a pastor. You're an ordained pastor. Oh, that's the best news we could have had. So the word then goes up to the minister carrying out the service, and he makes this very happy announcement to the crowd. My friends, I have wonderful news. Pastor Smith has come to visit us all the way from America, and I'm going to ask him to conduct tonight's exorcism. And I'm sometimes asked, how did he do? And two things. One, all he knew about exorcism was from movies, and two, he did very well. Put that together as you like. African churches, Asian churches, emerging churches believe in the healing of mind and body as a paramount goal of what they should be doing. And any American church or any European church that fails to appreciate that has no business trying to speak to them about that. I offer you one quote. This is a leader of a West African church. And this is a sermon. Why are we in this church? We are all here in this church because we have found healing here. But for this church, the great majority of us here assembled would not be alive today. That is the reason why we are here. Whatever denomination you are looking at, Methodist, Presbyterian, Anglican, Catholic, any, they take these issues very seriously, or they do not survive as denominations. Once again, this is another story. I could almost make it a guessing game, and I won't, but let me just tell you the story. Again, a fairly typical scene. Imagine an African church service. Yes, hundreds of people trying to squeeze into a building that there isn't room for them. And at this service, a woman announces that she's been healed from a spinal complaint. And she wants to testify. And other people stand up, and one person says, I've been healed of this. I've been healed of this. And it starts going on and on and on, until finally the deacon of the church, wanting to see the service end before next Sunday, says, all right, no more individual testimonies. Show of hands. How many people have been healed of this sort of disease? 18, 19. How many of this sort of disease? 4, 6, 8. Oh, what sort of church was this? The Roman Catholic Church. You get the idea that things that you might associate with one kind of denomination, one kind of church, range across the spectrum. All churches, in a way, are healing churches. And that does not necessarily just mean physical healing. It means emotional, spiritual healing, healing from substance abuse. And once again, one of the most quoted passages is the line from James about the church offering anointing and prayer for the sick. Now you'll notice here I am dealing with many concepts which are very familiar to this audience. I'm talking about ideas about what? Discussing ideas of the temple, discussing continuing prophecy, discussing ideas of healing, even, I suppose, discussing James, which has its influence. And you just have to be in a different kind of mindset. Many of the evils which Christians believe they are fighting and should be fighting are evils that no longer have anything like the power that we attribute to them, that we might think. In the West, for example, very few of us believe in ancestral evil. Very few of us believe that our grandparents did something, therefore we are being punished for this. This is a strange, superstitious idea. In large sections of Africa and Asia, that is a cardinal belief. Probably in India, you have 150 million people who are consigned to the lowest caste, who are treated worse than black Americans were ever treated during the years of segregation because of their conduct in previous wars. Now imagine in a society like that, reading the New Testament, reading about Jesus who arrives and eats with, which is the guide to who you are prepared to mix with, eats with anyone, mixes with anyone, destroys ideas of caste. Imagine that read by an audience of people who have perhaps suffered violence because they once wandered near a temple, never mind tried to go in it, for which they would be killed. It's only when you read something like that that you appreciate the radicalism, perhaps, of the Christian message. And there are so many other passages. I come back to this idea about food. Food is so important because it decides who you are, who you eat with, and who you're allowed to eat with. If, for example, you're a high caste person and you eat with somebody who is low caste, your caste has been damaged or destroyed. It has to be restored by all these kind of rituals. Then look at the passage, which is one of the ones which people still read and tell each other about in large sections of India and Africa with disbelief, which is the story where Jesus is taking a rest and a Samaritan woman comes to the well and Jesus has a chat with her. And we read this and we think, well, that it's a nice story, it's got a couple of nice angles to it. Try imagining reading that in a society where Jesus is doing something which is absolutely wrong at every point, and where the woman literally is doing something for which she could be killed. We have lost so much of our capacity to be shocked by the radicalism of the scriptures, which they have not lost in African and Asian churches. And when they've got over that shock, that is when they tend to express a new interest in this very radical religion called Christianity. I'll just offer you a poem. This is a quote from a poem by Longfellow. And I don't know if Longfellow would be more amazed by being quoted as an expert on Christianity or as an expert on Christianity in Africa and Asia, but one of the above. This is a poem called The Sicilians Tale, and he imagines a medieval king, King Robert. On St. John's Eve, at Vespers, proudly sat, and heard the priests chant the Magnificat. And as he listened o'er and o'er again, repeated like a burden or refrain, he caught the words, "Deposuit potentes de sede et exaltavit humiles." Slowly lifting up his kingly head, he to a learned clerk beside him said, "What mean those words?" The clerk made answer meet, "He has put down the mighty from their seat, and has exalted them of low degree." Thereat King Robert muttered scornfully, "'Tis well that such seditious words are sung only by priests and in the Latin tongue. For unto priests and people be it known, there is no power can push me from my throne." And leaning back, he yawned and fell asleep, lulled by the chant, monotonous and deep. And those words, "He has put down the mighty from their seat and has exalted them of low degree," in some ways could be a kind of motto of Global South Christianity, which has served to take people who were outside the traditional order, people who were marginalized, people who did not have the right to speak, and has given them what sociologist David Martin calls tongues of fire, the right to speak out. A couple of quick observations. In America, people often think in terms of liberation theology as something on the left. It means a secular political attitude. Deliverance means healing and spiritual warfare, and it's on the right. In Africa and Asia, the two are the same word, and they are one. African Asian churches preach deliverance and liberation, or they do not succeed. They speak messages of secular and spiritual liberation. Now, that's a very radical message. Final story. My book, one conversation once upon a time with a lady from the Episcopal Church, who was a very sort of, I suppose, wealthy, well-heeled lady. And she said roughly the following, you've in this book, you tell this wonderful story of these millions, these hundreds of millions of Christians in Africa and Asia, and this new kind of Christianity that's spreading all over the world. And it's so biblical, and it's so apostolic, and it's passionate. It's like the earliest days of Christianity. Tell me, as Americans, as Christians, as Episcopalians, what can we do to stop this? And two things. One, I don't make this up. This is true. And secondly, she's right. What I think they've got right in the Global South is they've actually got the power to see the Scriptures for as radical a message as they are. Maybe the challenge in the Global North is to try and see the same message. Thank you.